2008년 금융위기 이후 글로벌 경제 질서가 급변하고 있습니다. 데일리 세계전략포럼은 국제 금융 질서의 변화를 상징하는 키워드를 경제 권력의 이동으로 정했습니다. 이 같은 변화의 흐름을 짚어줄 기조연사로 로버트 루빈을 선정했습니다. 6월 14일과 15일 이틀간 세계전략포럼에서 두 차례의 기조연설을 마친 그를 단독으로 만났습니다. 글로벌 경제 질서의 한계, 이에 따른 글로벌 지배구조의 변화, 금융위기를 계기로 불거진 금융규제의 합법, 미국 경제와 한국 경제의 핵심 이슈들을 주제로 이야기를 나누었습니다. Thanks for joining us today.
Delighted to be with you.
Yes, it's great to have you today.
It's very nice to be here.
Yeah. The theme of the World Strategy Forum is economic power shift. So I would like to ask about economic power shift. Since the financial crisis, the global economic order has been changing from the US-centered unipolar system to the multipolar system. So global economic power moved from advanced country to emerging market. So, do you think the economic power shift to emerging market will turn into reality?
I actually have a slightly different view. I think it's a much longer process that's been going on. Mm-hmm. I think you've had an historic transformation of the global economy that's been underway for quite some time. And I think that China, India, Korea, and other emerging market countries, particularly in Asia,
yes,
have, through rapid growth and productivity increases, become a more and more important part of the global economy, and I think that will continue. Mm-hmm. I also think the United States is likely, once we get through this period, in the longer term to do well economically.
Yes.
So I think the center of the global economy will move toward Asia, but I think the United States will remain a very important economy for a long, long time to come.
So is the U.S. economy capable of exercising the international economic leadership?
Well, I think leadership in the international economy, it's a very important question. I think leadership in the international economy will have to be done in some way that heavily involves the emerging market countries, and it's going to have to be done multilaterally, not bilaterally, or not unilaterally, But there's got to be some effective leadership if the global community is going to be effective in dealing with these large transnational issues, and I think how that's going to happen all needs still to be worked out.
So, what precondition for the U.S. economy to take the leadership in the future?
Well, I think there are two sets of issues. One is the conditions necessary for the U.S. economy to be part of the global leadership. We have very great strengths, long-term strengths I'm talking about, and we have real challenges we have to meet, like our fiscal problems. But if we meet our fiscal problems, and if we remain a strong economy, which I think is likely in the long term, I'm not talking about the short term, but the long term, then we'll be part of that global leadership. But it won't be a single country anymore providing the leadership in a way that used to occur, but rather it'll be the United States working with a number of other countries, and I think Korea has a very important role to play in all that.
So the G20 is represents the voices of multilateral country at first time, I think. So can the G20 establish itself as the premier forum, as the global governance structure?
The G20 is, I think, a very good development, and I think it is the premier forum today. But if the G20 is going to provide effective global governance on these very difficult issues like global climate change and cyber terrorism and issues of that
So
kind.
you mean that G20 could expand its role to geopolitical issue as well as economic issue?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I think it needs to deal with both, and I think it needs to find some way. And I don't know how this is going to happen, but some way to make decisions and then also to give those decisions some authority. Because right now, all that it can do is have leaders or finance ministers get together and try to reach some cooperative agreement, but then it's up to the individual countries whether or not to go along. So, for example, in climate change, it hasn't worked. And I think we need to find some way of strengthening that process.
So what challenges should the G20 face, or what role should the G20 take?
Well, it's a complicated question. I think the G20 needs to be what you said. I think it needs to be a forum. But I also think over time these issues, we are so interdependent now that what happens in the major economies has enormous effect on other economies around the world. And then a lot of issues cross border. Cyber terrorism is not an issue that any one country can deal with by itself. And financial regulation is another area where it's very helpful, I think, to have cross-border cooperation. So I think we need to find some way, though I don't know what that way will be, for the G20 or the other institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, to have more authority than they have now. But that's very difficult because no country wants to give up its sovereignty. So I don't know how that's going to work out.
Yeah, so you mentioned about the financial regulation. So since the financial crisis, the tighter financial regulation should be supported. I think the excessive regulation may hinder the financial innovation. I think. What do you think about it?
Well, I think we need stronger financial regulation. Virtually nobody saw the possibility of a crisis of the kind that we had in 2007, 2008. And the downside of the financial system turned out to be far worse than virtually anybody saw. Regulators or people in financial institutions, commentators, etc. So we need strong regulation. On the other hand, as you correctly say, we need a balance so that we get strong regulation, but we find a balance between that and also not unduly interfering with lending and with constructive innovation. Though if we had a little less innovation, I think that would be okay too.
How will strict regulation in the financial market could affect the global economy?
I think if we have stronger protection, then we'll have less systemic risk, and I think that would be constructive because we'll reduce the likelihood of future crises, though I think inevitably in a market-based system there will from time to time be disruptions. But I think the issue for the regulators is finding some balance so that we have tighter regulation, but we don't make it so tight that we really create a major problem in terms of bank lending.
Let's turn to the global economic outlook. Do you believe the global economy faces a lot of problems? The U.S. fiscal deficit, the EU's sovereign debt problem, the China's tight belt, the inflationary pressure, like that. So, do you believe the global economy will overcome these kind of main countries, the risk, such as U.S. fiscal deficit, U.S. sovereign debt problem?
Well, as you say, the global economy faces very major problems in the U.S. fiscal, in Europe. Sovereign debt crisis.
Yes.
In Asia, you have inflation, which is a short-term problem, and you have the transition to domestic demand-led growth. Look, I think these are very complicated, and ultimately it's going to depend on our political systems.
So you all the time maintain the complexity and
well, because
uncertainty.
it is complex and it's uncertain, and I think the dominant overriding condition of the global economy for a long time to come is going to be complexity and uncertainty. I think the United States is likely to deal with its fiscal problem, but I think it's going to be a messy process. Europe, it seems to me, is more uncertain. I think Europe, these problems are very difficult and they involve different nations coming together. China certainly has had a tremendous success since 1978 with the beginning of reform. That seems to me to create a high probability that they will deal with their issues. But all of these are very difficult issues and are going to require a great deal of political will.
Among them, what is the the most serious obstacle in the global economy?
I think the single most serious question cuts across all these issues, and that is the political will to do what is needed.
But do you maintain the fiscal soundness? But do you believe the U.S. economy needs more quantitative easing?
I think that with our 10-year bond rate now around 3% or thereabouts, it seems to me that additional quantitative easing would have very little, if any, positive effect.
Very positive and negative.
Very little, if any.
Yes.
Very little, if any. And I think there are real risks.
Risk, yes.
And that's a judgment the Federal Reserve Board is going to have to make, but
Yeah.
I don't see where there's much positive to be gained by it, given the rates are already so low. And I think there are real risks, including the risk of undermining the confidence in the commitment of the Fed to fight long-term inflation. There's no short-term inflation risk, in my opinion. But I think it's very important that the Fed maintain confidence, credibility with respect to its long-term commitment to fight inflation.
Yes, so this kind of the loose monetary policy could lead to the burden of emerging market. In the keynote speech, you said that the developing countries' inflationary pressure spread to the developed countries,
Could.
right? Yeah, but I think the United States inflationary pressure leads to the burden of the Chinese economy. So, do you think I think the Chinese economy could face with the imminent burst of asset bubble. What do you think about that?
I don't have a view on that, but I think if China, I don't know whether China faces a bubble or not, but if China is worried about its own inflation, it could obviously have a
excessive demand.
Yeah, well, they could mess demand, but I think what they could obviously do is to change their exchange rate, because if they substantially appreciated the exchange rate, then that would reduce
exchange rate system.
Yeah, if they went to a higher exchange rate, that would reduce inflationary pressure. I don't think that the Chinese inflation problem is a function of monetary conditions in the United States. I do think that one thing China can do is tighten monetary policy, which is apparently what they're doing from what one reads. But another thing they could do is go to a higher exchange rate, which would reduce inflationary pressure.
Okay, so how can the U.S. government implement the stimulus package without undermining the fiscal soundness?
Well, my own view is that what we did in 2009 with fiscal stimulus was necessary and very, very important, because we were on the brink of something really awful. Even today, we have very difficult economic conditions. We have very high unemployment, and many Americans are in a very difficult position. I don't think that we should do another major stimulus unless we do it in the context
That's
of,
for instance,
in the framework of a serious deficit reduction plan. Or to put the same thing differently, if we put in place a serious long-term deficit reduction plan, enacted now, that would take effect in 2 or 3 years to give the recovery a little bit of time to hopefully take hold, I think in that context you could do some fiscal stimulus. But if you do it without that context, I think you take a risk of increasing the uncertainty, further undermining confidence, and also take a risk with the markets.
So, even though you think in the short term the U.S. economy faces a lot of the serious problem, but in the long term, your point of view about the U.S. economy is very, very good, because the rule of law or the flexible labor and capital market. But could you tell me about the more detailed explanation, the long-term outlook for the U.S. economy?
Yeah, I think in the short term, and I think this is going to last for a while. We face a lot of headwinds. and I think growth is likely to be moderate with a slow recovery. I think the chances of a double dip are very low. And if you look at the various factors in the economy right now, I think they support that view. In the long run, the great strength of the American economy has consistently been the vitality of our culture. We have a dynamic culture. We have a willingness to take entrepreneurial risk. And in addition to that, we have a very large national economy. We have a rule of law. We have flexible labor and capital markets. We have an abundance of natural resources, and these recent discoveries of new technologies, the technologies called fracking and horizontal drilling, have made accessible vast new resources of natural gas in the United States. You put all that together, and I think we have the ingredients to be successful. But to realize that potential, we have to meet these very difficult challenges of restoring a sound fiscal position, public investment in areas critical for competitiveness, and reform in a number of areas.
Okay. I want to deal with the Korean economy. Yes. The Korean government implements the tax cut policy so to boost the economy. But some people criticize that this tax cut policy is not efficient without producing any visible results, such as the job creation or the corporate investment. What's your policy recommendation for tax cut debate in Korea?
I don't have a view. I know that Korea is doing very well right now. You know, you're growing. It looks like you're growing at 3.5%, 4%, something like that. Inflation looks like it's about, well, headline inflation about 4%, core inflation maybe 3 and a fraction, whatever it is. Your debt to GDP ratio is about 35%, I think.
But I think
But I don't have a view on Korean tax policy.
But generally, the government spending is more efficient than the tax cut to boost the economy.
Well, that's a complicated question. Government spending is, depending what the spending is. You know, government spending on projects that are happening right now in terms of creating macroeconomic demand is more efficient than tax cuts generally. But if you have government spending on projects that go out long periods of time, it may actually create less immediate demand, macroeconomic demand, than taxes. So it really depends on what tax policy. If your tax cuts go to low and middle income people and middle income people, then the probability is that the great preponderance of it, most of it, will be spent. If it goes to more affluent people, then a lot of it will be saved. So it depends what your policies are.
Your book, in an uncertain world, I remember that you criticized the tax cut policy in the United States.
Yeah, I was very critical of our tax cut policy because we did it at a time when we had finally reestablished sound fiscal conditions after 30 years, and I thought it would be much wiser to use our surpluses to pay down our debt than it would be to provide tax cuts.
So, tax cut policy could lead to the fiscal deficit more seriously, right?
Well, in the United States at that time, we were still in the process of getting back on a sound footing fiscally. And I thought that the risk was, and unfortunately and very sadly for the United States, this is what happened, that if we had a tax cut, and that tax cut was aimed very heavily toward the most affluent people, to the people with the most money, that we would be doing away with some of our surplus, and we would run the risk of unraveling the really fragile political will around fiscal discipline, and that's exactly what happened. And once we started, then we took all kinds of measures that moved us from having pretty substantial surpluses to having very large deficits. Exactly what I feared would happen.
Yes. Okay. So, when you were the Secretary of the Treasury in 1997,
95 through 99.
Yeah, I know that, but at that time the Korean financial crisis happened. So you recommended the austerity measure. You recommend the austerity measure to Korea. Do you think that strategy was appropriate?
Oh yeah, I think what you had in Korea at the time was you had a crisis of confidence, and it seemed to us that well, you had a crisis of confidence, and you also had a little bit of a problem because Korea was thought to have large foreign exchange reserves, but it turned out that the reserves that were thought to exist didn't exist. So what was needed was a set of policies that would restore confidence, and our view was that you needed fiscal austerity and tighter monetary policy, correct, and some structural reform that the markets were very focused on, correct.
But should that strategy be applied to the U.S. in 2008?
No, because the United States in 2008 had a different problem. Our problem wasn't, we certainly had a crisis, but it wasn't a crisis of confidence of the same kind. It was a crisis in the financial system, and what we needed then was to repair our financial system, and we did have very large structural reform, and we needed to have, and structural action with respect to the financial system, and we needed macro demand, which we did through stimulus.
Okay. Thanks for sharing your insightful comment.
Oh,
thank you.
They were very good questions. I thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice to be with you. That was very good.
세계전략포럼을 처음 준비하면서 직면한 가장 큰 고민은 기존 인사를 선정하는 작업이었는데요. 고심 끝에 나온 답이 바로 로버트 루빈이었습니다. 포럼 개막 전날 수행원 한 명 없이 캐주얼 차림이 수수한 모습으로 나타난 그는 예상보다 친숙하고 유쾌한 인물이었습니다. 인터뷰 시간에도 기자의 다소 불편할 수도 있는 질문 내용에 성의 있게 답해주었고요. 루빈과의 짧은 만남은 즐거운 추억이었습니다.